here we are again to read some more of the BFG and Dexter. For some reason, this is so hilarious. When Mrs. Colby starts to read now, get my book out, he comes from anywhere in the house. He doesn't really come for story time. Well, he did come to see Puff. And poetry, and he can't even really hear. He's old, 13. So I don't know how he hears us reading, but as soon as I start to get my book out and read, here he is. So he's so sweet. Well, if you can remember when we left off last time, the witching hour in the middle of the night when it is so quiet and so dark, the giant came and snatched Sophie right out of her window in a blanket and carried her off at some kind of super mega high speed to his cave. And they seem to have traveled into kind of a different world. The rocks are blue, the ground is yellow, it's all barren and desolate. And then he came to a giant cave. And remember, he's taller than a 2-story house. So this hole in the cave had to be huge that they went in. And when he and Sophie got inside, all of the walls on all of the cave walls were lined with glass jars. And we don't know what that's all about. So we'll back up just a little bit to get our brains warmed up to where we left off, which is always a good idea to go back and read a little chunk of yesterday to get your brain ready for today. So this says, the giant's trousers were faded green and were far too short in the legs. On his bare feet he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that for some reason had holes cut along each side, with a large hole at the end where his toe stuck out. Sophie, crouching on the floor of the cave in her nightie, gazed back at him through her thick steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind, and a finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine. Remember, she's still in her nightie because he got her at night. "Ha!" shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. "What has we got us here?" His booming voice rolled off the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. This is called the BFG. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand, carried her across the cave, and put her on the table. Oh, now he's really going to eat me, Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and it seemed to be able to move inwards and outwards any way he wished. "I is hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned, showing his massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. Now I hope, no matter what age you are, that you've got your movie screen going, because this author gives us a lot of really descriptive detail of what our giant looks like. So can you picture the big giant teeth that are the size of bread? And all the other, just got to listen for the descriptions because he puts a ton of them in. "Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let a bellow of laughter out. "Just because I is a giant, you think I is a man-gobbling cannibal?" he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all cannibaling and murderful, and they does gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere around. Bone-crunching giant crunches up 2 wopsy, whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-busting. The noise of crunching bones goes crackety-crack for miles around." "Ouch," Sophie said. "Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings from Turkey," the giant said. "Every night Bone Cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble up Turks." Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark, she became quite angry. "Why Turks?" she blurted out. "What's wrong with the English?" "Oh, Bone-crunching giant says Turks is tasting every so much juicier and more scrumptious. Bone Cruncher says Turkish human beings has a glamourly flavor. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of Turkey." "Well, I suppose they would," Sophie said. "Of course they would," the giant shouted. "Every human being is diddly and different. Some is scrumptious, and some is uckle slushy. Greeks is full of ucky slush. No giant has ever eaten Greeks, ever." "Why not?" said Sophie. "Oh, Greeks from Greece is tasting greasy," said the giant. "I imagine that's possible too," Sophie said. She was wondering with a little bit of a tremble what all this talking about eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, she must simply play along with this peculiar giant and smile at his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite by talking about food. As I am saying, the giant went on, all human beings is having a different flavor. Human beings from Panama is tasting very strong of hats. Why hats? Sophie asked. You is not very clever, the giant said, moving his great ears around. I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bundongle. Do you like vegetables? Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation toward a slightly less dangerous food. You is trying to change the subject, the giant said sternly. We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of human beings. The human being is not a vegetable. Oh, but the bean is a vegetable, said Sophie. Not the human being, said the giant. The human being has 2 legs, and a vegetable has no legs at all. Sophie did not argue anymore. The last thing she wanted to do was make the giant cross. The human being, the giant went on, is coming in dillions of different flavors. For instance, human beings from Wales is tasting a very whooshy of fish. There is something very fishy about Wales. You mean W-H-A-L-E-S, whales, Sophie said. Wales is something quite different. Wales is Wales, the giant said. Don't gobble funk around with words. I will now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey has a most distinguishable woolly tickle on your tongue, said the giant. Human beings from Jersey is tasting of cardigans. You mean jerseys, Sophie said. You are once again gobble funking, the giant shouted. Don't do it. This is a serious and snitchy subject. May I continue? Please do, said Sophie. Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs, the giant went on. Of course, said Sophie. They taste like Great Danes. Wrong, said the giant, slapping his thigh. Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they is tasting of Labradors. Then what do people of Labrador taste like, Sophie asked. Danes, said the giant triumphantly. Great Danes. Aren't you getting a bit mixed up, said Sophie. Oh, I is a very mixed up giant, the giant said, but I does do my best, and I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know one who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper. Wellington, Sophie said. Where's Wellington? Your head is full of squashed flies, the giant said. Wellington is in New Zealand. The human beings in Wellington has an especially scrumptious taste, said the well-eating giant. What do the people of Wellington taste of? Sophie said. Boots, said the giant. Of course, said Sophie. I should have known. Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather just get it over and done with right away and then be kept hanging around. What sort of human beings do you eat? She asked, trembling. Me, shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars shake on the shelves. Me gobbling up human beings? This I never. The others, yes. All the others is gobbling them up every night, but not me. I is a freaky giant. I is a nice and jumbly giant. I is the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. I is the big friendly giant. I is the BFG. What is your name? My name is Sophie, Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news that she had just heard. This chapter is called The Giants, and you really have to get your movie screen going as they describe some of the giants. But if you're so nice and friendly, Sophie said, then why did you snatch me out of my bed and run away with me? Because you saw me, said the big friendly giant. If anyone has ever seen a giant, he or she must be taken away hip switch. Why? Asked Sophie. Well, first of all, said the BFG, human beings is not really believing in giants, is they? Human beings is not thinking that we exist. I do, said Sophie. Ah, but that is only because you have seen me, cried the BFG. I cannot possibly allow anyone, even little girls, to be seeing me and staying at home. The first thing you would be doing is you would be scuttling around and yodeling the news that you is actually seeing a giant, and then a great giant hunter, a great mighty giant look-see would be starting all over the world, with human beings all rummaging for the great giant you saw and getting wild and excited. People would be coming and rushing and brushing past me with goodness knows what, and they would be catching me and locking me in a cage to be stared at. They would be putting me into the zoo or some bunkum house with all those squiggling hippo dumplings and crocodilies. Sophie knew that what the giant said was true. If any person reported actually having seen a giant haunting the streets of a town at night, there would most certainly be a terrific hullabaloo all across the world. I will bet you, the BFG went on, that you would have been splashing the news all over the wonky world, wouldn't you, if I hadn't wiggled you away? I suppose I would, Sophie said. And that would never do, said the BFG. So what happens to me now? Sophie asked. If you do go back, you will be telling the world, said the BFG, most likely on the telly bunkum box and the radio squeaker. So you will just have to be staying here with me for the rest of your life. Oh no, cried Sophie. Oh yes, said the BFG. But I is warning you to never go whiffling about out of this cave without I is with you, or you will be coming to an ucky-mucky end. I is showing you now who is going to be eating you up, if they is ever even catching a tiny glimpse of you. The big friendly giant picked Sophie up off the table and carried her over to the cave entrance. He rolled the huge stone to one side and said, Peep out over there, little girl, and tell me what you is seeing. Sophie, sitting on the BFG's hand, peeped out of the cave. The sun was now up and shining fiery hot over the great yellow wasteland with all the blue rocks and dead trees. Is you seeing them? The BFG asked. Sophie squinted through the glare of the sun. She saw several tremendously tall figures moving among the rocks about 500 yards away. 3 or 4 others were sitting quite motionless on the rocks themselves. This is giant country, the BFG said. Those is giants, every one. It was a brain-boggling sight. The giants were all naked except for a short skirt around their waist, and their skins were burnt brown by the sun. But it was the sheer size of each one of them that boggled Sophie's brain most of all. They were simply colossal, far taller and wider than the big friendly giant upon whose hand she was now sitting. And oh, how ugly they were! Most of them had large bellies. All of them had long arms and big feet. They were too far away for their faces to be seen clearly, and perhaps that was a good thing. What on earth are they doing? Sophie asked. Nothing, the BFG said. They is just moochling and foochling around and waiting for night to come. Then they will be galloping off to places where people is living to find their suppers. You mean Turkey? Sophie said. Oh, bone-crunching giant will be galloping off to Turkey, of course, said the BFG. But the others will be whiffling off to all sorts of flung-away places, like Wellington for the booty flavor, and Panama for the hattie taste. Every giant is having their own favorite hunting ground. Do they ever go to England? Sophie asked. Often, said the BFG. They say the English is tasting so wonderfully of crod scallop. I'm not sure I know what that means, Sophie said. Meaning is not important, said the BFG. I cannot be right all the time. Often I is left instead of right. And are all those beastly giants over there really going off to eat people? Sophie asked. Oh, all of them is guzzling human beings every night, the BFG answered. All of them excepting me. That is why you will be coming to an ucky-mucky end if them should ever be getting their gogglers on you. You would be swallowed up like a piece of frumpkin pie, all in one dollop. But eating people is horrible, Sophie cried. It's frightful. Why doesn't somebody stop them? And who, please, is going to be stopping them? Asked the BFG. Couldn't you? Asked Sophie. Oh, never in a pig's whistle, said the BFG. All of those man-eating giants is enormous and fierce. They is at least 2 times my wideness and double my royal highness. Twice as high as you? Cried Sophie. Oh, easily that, said the BFG. You is seeing them in the distance, but just wait till you is getting up close. Those giants is all at least 50 feet tall, with huge muscles, and cockles alive, oh. I is the titchy one. I is the runt. 24 feet of puddle nuts in giant country. You mustn't feel bad about it, Sophie said. I think you're just great. Why, even your toes must be as big as sausages. Bigger, said the BFG, looking pleased. They is as big as bumplehammers. How many giants are out there? Sophie asked. 9 altogether, said the BFG. That means, said Sophie, that somewhere in the world, every single night, 9 wretched people get carried away and eaten alive. More, said the BFG. It is all depending, you see, on how big the human beings is. Japanese beings is very small, so a giant will need to be gobbling up about 6 Japanese before he is feeling full. Others, like the Norway people and the Yankee Doodles, is ever so much bigger, and usually 2 or 3 of those makes a good tuck-in. But do those disgusting giants go every single night into the country? Sophie asked. All countries excepting Greece is getting visited sometime or another, said the BFG. The country, which is giant country, visits is depending on how he is feeling. If it is very warm weather and a giant is feeling as hot as a sizzle pan, he will probably go galloping far to the Frisbee north to get him an Eskimo, or to cool him down. A nice fat Eskimo to a giant is like a lovely ice cream lolly to you. I'll take your word for it, Sophie said. And then again, if it's a frosty night and the giant's is frigid cold, he will probably point his nose toward the sweltering hotlands to guzzle a few hot tottens to warm him up. How perfectly horrible, Sophie said. Nothing hots a cold giant like a hot Hottentot, said the BFG. And if you were to put me down on the ground and I was to go walking among them, Sophie said, would they really eat me up? Oh, like a whiff-swiddle, cried the BFG. And what is more, you is so small, they wouldn't even have to chew you. The first one to be seeing you would pick you up in his fingers and you would go down like a drop of rainwater. Oh, let's go back inside, said Sophie. I hate even watching them. Have you noticed all the funny ways that the BFG talks? He has all kinds of different words for everything. You just kind of have to, and then you know they're kind of close to what he's talking about, but he kind of pronounces them, gives them his own spin. This chapter's called The Marvelous Ears, and remember Sophie said he had those big giant ears? Back in the cave, the big friendly giant sat Sophie down once again on the enormous table. Is you quite snuggly there in your nightie, he asked. You isn't frigid cold. I'm fine, Sophie said. I cannot help thinking, said the BFG, about your poor mother and father. By now they must be jippling and scumping all over the house. Hello, hello, where is my Sophie gone? Oh, I don't have a mother and father, Sophie said. They both died when I was a baby. Oh, you poor little scrumplet, cried the BFG. Is you missing them very badly? Not really, said Sophie, because I never really knew them. Oh, you is making me sad, the BFG said, rubbing his eyes. Don't be sad, said Sophie. No one is going to be worrying too much about me. That place you took me from was the village orphanage. We were all orphans there. Oh, you is an orphan? Yes. How many is there in there? 10 of us, said Sophie, all girls. Was you happy there? Said the BFG. I hated it, said Sophie. The woman who ran it was called Mrs. Clonkers, and if she caught you breaking any of the rules, like getting out of bed at night or not folding your clothes, you got punished. How was you getting punished? She locked us in the dark cellar for a day and a night without anything to eat or drink. Oh, that rotten old rob snapper, cried the BFG. It was horrid, said Sophie. We used to dread it. There were rats down there. We could hear them creeping about. That filthy old fizzwiggler, the BFG shouted. That is the horridest thing I is hearing for years. You is making me even sadder than ever. All at once, a huge tear that would have filled a bucket rolled down one of the BFG's cheeks and fell with a splash on the floor. It made quite a puddle. Sophie watched with astonishment. What a strange and moody creature this is, she thought. One moment he's telling me my head is full of squash flies, and the next moment his heart is melting for me because Mrs. Clonkers locked us in the cellar. The thing that worries me, Sophie said, as having to stay in this dreadful place for the rest of my life. The orphanage was pretty awful, but I wouldn't have been there forever, would I? This is all my fault, the BFG said. I is the one who is kid-snatching you. Yet another enormous tear welled up from his eye and splashed on the floor. Now I come to think of it, I won't actually be here all that long, Sophie said. I is afraid you will, said the BFG. No, I won't, said Sophie. Those brutes out there are bound to catch me sooner or later, and they'll just have me for tea. I is never letting that happen, said the BFG. For a few moments the cave was silent. Then Sophie said, May I ask you a question? The BFG wiped the tears from his eyes with the back of his hand and gave Sophie a long, thoughtful stare. Shoot away, he said. Would you please tell me what you were doing in our village last night? Why were you poking that long trumpet thing into the Gucci children's bedroom and then blowing through it? Aha! Cried the BFG, sitting up suddenly in his chair. Now we is getting nosier than a Parker. In the suitcase you were carrying, Sophie said. What on earth was that all about? The BFG stared suspiciously at the small girl sitting on the cross-legged table. You is asking me to tell you a whoppsie big secret, he said. Secrets that nobody is hearing before. I won't tell a soul, Sophie said. I swear it. How could I anyway? I'm stuck here for the rest of my life. You could be telling the other giants. No, I couldn't, said Sophie. You told me they would eat me up the moment they saw me. And so they would, said the BFG. You is a human being, and human beings is like straw bunkles and cream to the giants. Well, if they're going to eat me the moment they see me, then I wouldn't have time to tell them anything, would I, said Sophie. You wouldn't, said the BFG. Then why did you say I might? Oh, because I is brimful of buzzburgers, said the BFG. If you was listening to everything I is saying, you would be getting an earache. Please tell me what you were doing in the village, said Sophie. I promise you can trust me. And that is where we're going to stop for today, right on a little cliffhanger, to find out what the BFG was doing there. Why was he carrying that big suitcase? But you know what we know about him is through some of his actions, being so gentle when he carries her around, asking her if she's cold in her nightie, and having tears fall when he's hearing about her story that she was an orphan, tells us a little bit about the BFG. So we always want to pay attention to our character's actions because we learn a lot about him. And I'm getting a feeling about this BFG that he has a big heart and that he's emotional and he's just a very gentle guy. So I hope you enjoyed the story. We will be back tomorrow with some more, and I can't wait to see you. Bye.